Hi everyone, I'm Jim Heidt, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the Ogdensburg and Norwood, a layout based upon my family experience of operating a real railroad of that name back when I was a kid in high school. So the layout is an HO scale. It's a large double-deck layout, and the main line extends over 400 feet. It takes 20 real minutes to run from point to point at a prototypical speed. But we've been building this layout now for the better part of 30 years, and I have a dedicated group of friends that come down every Tuesday night. Most of it is completed. We have JMRI, computer access, Digitrax control, and the layout is not completed. There's still some scenery work and work being done on it, and you'll probably see it along the way, but I couldn't be more pleased with what we have here and the friends that I have working on it. So I'm glad you're here. Let's take a ride on the O&N. Shows that there is yet another staging area built on top of the helix, which is the New York Central's Adirondack division coming out of Utica, all heading all the way up to Tupper Lake. And so that allows us another interchange with the New York Central, which we'll talk about later when we get to Tupper. Now we're at the upper level now, coming out of the helix into Tupper Lake. And you may have noticed by now that all the station locations have lighted signs with notations underneath of it as which direction is heading north and which is south. And that's all to assist visiting operators so they can come and run this layout the first time with some help. In any event, Tupper is a challenge. It was a challenge to design and to build, really. So what you'll see later, I'm sure, on a close-up photography is the track coming out of the top of the helix, which is the New York Central in 1948, the Adirondack division coming up from Utica. Now, originally it was the New York and Ottawa, and the New York and Ottawa ran from Utica all the way up through Tupper Lake, through Moira, up on the roof of the state crossing the Rutland, and off really going into Ottawa back years and years ago. So what we've done is we tried to figure out how we could integrate an operation with the central. So here is the central line going straight back, and we had to figure out how can we disguise that. So what we did is we have a stub track going back with foliage and trees folding in over it, a highway bridge in the back on top of it, kind of to frame up the train which sits in that track. And we got a New York Central train here, permanently located, blocking the line. So the fiction is that north around Paul Smith's, heading up toward Moira, there's a washout, okay? So trains coming up from Utica, they can't continue on this trackage. So what they do is they cross over onto the Ogdensburg and Norwood, and they run on trackage rights all the way to Potsdam, going north of Potsdam, where they can go back on the New York Central trackage. So that fiction of having that washout and that dead end up there allows us to run New York Central trains on this layout for a short distance, from Tupper to Potsdam and back and forth. So that's Tupper Lake. Here is the interchange track in the front with the New York Central and the Ogdensburg and Norwood. And one of the fine details is the ballast is a different color than the ballast on the O&N. That's one very subtle way of making the distinction between the two lines. And that's Tupper. Over to my right is Long Lake. And Long Lake begins from here, stretches all the way along this aisle And Long Lake Station is a station that I scratch built based upon plans, again, written up by Don Andrews, where I wanted a combination station, restaurant, and hotel. So that's that was a combined effort, and it came out very well, if I don't mind saying so myself. Backing down, which we'll get a view of later behind me, at the upper end is Blue Mountain Lake. Blue Mountain Lake is the junction for the ore mines, for the branch line for the ore mines that comes into the main. But it also is it's a throwback in the passenger days of the Adirondack trains, which brought private cars up for people who had real money and parked them so they could go on excursions in the Adirondacks. So when you get down here with your camera, you'll see that there's a siding for a passenger car right in front of the station. And there's also an excursion boat, which was scratch built for me by Brian Curry. The only part that he didn't do really, well, no, I'm sorry. It was a 1x6 piece of lumber, which is the hull, and the rest of it he scratch built. And he named it for my prior wife, Suzanne, who had later passed away. I know taking a time with this video to talk about my dearest friends and what this region and division has meant to me. When I had a heart attack and I'm laying down in Utica in February during a blizzard, Brian Curry came from Weedsport, and he picked up my wife, who was afraid to drive, didn't know where to go in Utica, and drove her to Utica to see me in the hospital. I mean, that's the people that we have. That's who we are. And I'm thankful for that, of course. So take a good look at the boat Suzanne that Brian built for me. And over here to your right is Indian Lake. And the thing I'm proudest of in Indian Lake is the structure, which is the Indian Lake Box Company, which I scratch built and completely designed it. I mean, I made templates for it, did a whole bunch of stuff, hoping to get my AP certificate for structures. And we're also currently working on building the front side, the street side of Indian Lake, so that when you're standing and watching the train, you see the train going through essentially the canyon of structures on either side of it, which is next to the canyon where the stream goes through Indian Lake in the Adirondack Mountains. The other thing is the turnout control, and I'll do this very quickly. This is a small mock-up that I made to demonstrate the construction, and this is really the only original idea I ever had on anything. I'm so proud of this. But the turnout control is a 1.5-inch PVC cap, which you buy in any of the big box stores, recessed into the fascia of the layout, because when you have a wire body like mine, it's better to have as much recess as possible. And sticking out through it is the item which we turn, and that's a lipstick tube, if you wonder what that is. And these lipstick tubes are clear so that a bicolor LED shows through, green indicating it's for the track going straight, and it turns yellow when you turn it and throws the motor for the diverging route on the turnout. So I don't know to the extent you can see this, but the rotary motion of the lipstick tube turns into lateral motion, which fires off this light switch, and that either opens or closes the circuit to do everything else. Running the motor, and this is a homemade turnout control motor that I had made early on, and there's still some of them on the layout. But now I'm changing all over to tortoises with some minor modifications. But this is still some of these are just toggles, and those are ones that do not read back to the computer for the JMRI, whereas the ones with the lipstick tube do go back so that the computer knows which way to turn the signal. The upper deck is again identical to the lower in terms of its configuration. Over here on the right is speculator, and speculator is scenically complete with exception for some very minor details to be added. It's one of the older sections of the layout having been completed, and it's just a switching location on the layout. The thing that's emotionally significant to me is there's a coal dealer here, and the structure is a Muir Models kit, which is a model of a real structure that was behind the O&W station in Wurtsboro, New York, which was my parents' last home. They lived in the station. Half of it was their home, the other half of it was a museum, and that coaling tower is directly behind it. I think it's essentially collapsed now, but I'm very thankful I found it, and it has an emotional place on my layout. The opposite side here, excuse me, is Lake Pleasant. Lake Pleasant is the junction with the Utica branch, which is the track going on the back here, winding over to the staging that we looked at earlier. And these buildings are all scratch built. They're all scratch built, every one of them. The station here was a Don Andrews design of a structure that was in an old Kalmbach book that I had many years ago. And he modified it based upon my specifications. And Bob Verkel is the one who scratch built it. So again, more contributions from dear friends. That's Lake Pleasant. The upper deck is Wells. That's the next town north coming out of Northville. And Wells, there's nothing specific about it other than Wells happened to be the last community where Maribeth's father, who was a Wesleyan pastor, had his regular church, had regular church services. So Wells is kind of special to us, even though there was no railroad in Wells, and this is all fictional. This is the Dawson Springs section from the world-famous Virginian and Ohio Railroad of Allen McClellan. Back in the late 70s, when I was in law school out in western Ohio, I had the great pleasure of operating on Allen's layout a couple different times. But it was years later, after the construction of this layout really, that all of a sudden this piece became available. Brian Curry, who I mentioned before, had a very dear friend who was stationed in Dayton in the military. He went down there, found out that McClellan had cut up his layout, had it laying out on the front yard, and Brian just called me, did I want a piece of it? Of course, I said, sure. So Brian picked this up at no cost and brought it to me. And we modified this layout to stick this in here. This was the last piece added in. And I left the fascia the way it was on Allen's layout, obviously to pay honor to him and his world-famous V&O. The construction going further back, which is off camera now, is intentionally being a cut to design the difference between the V&O of Allen and Northville, which is the rest of my layout, and just having different geography, different scenery. And that's the reason for that cut. That's kind of off the scene. But I couldn't be happier to have a piece of Allen's layout here in the Ogdensburg and Norwood. So we're looking at the causeway over the Sacandaga. Sacandaga Lake is a artificial construction in reality. I believe that it was a modification to the valley through there to provide water for the New York State Barge Canal back in World War I. And it is a serious body of water even today. But in trying to figure out where the line was going through the Southern Division, I got down to Northville and continued south and had to cross the Sacandaga somehow because, of course, 1948, this is post-World War I. So I love the Rutland, and Shaughnessy's book shows some great pictures of the causeway of the Rutland across the north of Lake Champlain. And there's some photographs in there that are just beautiful. So I had to do that here in creating this causeway. And it's a nice variation, a distinction scenically from all the busyness in Ogdensburg situated physically below it, but giving you a whole different perspective. The background are all photos taken off of Bill Brown's Lark Products line, and we got to the point where we ran out of photographs and had to change it when we got down to the corner here. So I just happened to create this little island and put all these pine trees on it just to show to distract you, the visitor, from noticing the distinction between the views before the island and what's after the island. Just a little cheating visually. So the causeway was something new, and how did I do that? So the whole layout is built on a spline lattice roadbed, spline lattice topped by homosote, topped by what used to be called homobed. And this is all code 70 trackage on the main line, except for storage and staging, which is code 100. So the spline is located on top of posts, and it all sits obviously independently. And I had to figure out what to do about the spline. So what I did is I cut masonite in a standard width at a standard length, which I believe is about 3 inches or so. And then on top of that, I just took chunks of foam, blue foam, the kind of stuff used in installation and home construction, cut it up into chunks and just white glued it on to the foam. And then I painted it this semi-earth color, and on top of that, painted it this gray color. So they were just glued onto the side of this, going all the way down. The back side does not have that. The back side is open. It just has a little bit of riprap on the top, so somebody my height or a little bit higher can see that there's rocks on the other side, but it doesn't go all the way down. And this has been here for years, and it's held up pretty good. We need to touch it up with gray paint every now and then, but I couldn't be happier with how it looks. That's the causeway. Okay, so here we are at the terminal of the railroad, because the railroad really, again, is point to point. From Canada on the northern end, the southern division, and Pittsfield, Massachusetts on the southern end. So down here below is the elevator, the staging area, the staging yard, if you will, for Canada. And these are elevators that operate on threaded rod, half-inch threaded rod, with 24-volt DC motors on the end, running chain link connected to the sprockets on these threaded rods. And the whole thing operates down here on a microprocessor that Mike Lamond, one of our Tuesday night guys, had programmed and set up. So ideally, I'm not going to do it so it gets noisy, but ideally you push the button, and there's 3 different levels here. I don't know if you can see it, but you push the button and it causes the whole thing to move and to end up where you want it on those 3 different staging tracks on each elevator. They run it independently. And the way it works, and Ed may get a close-up of it later, is there's a digital counter down by the motors on each one of these chains, and it actually counts the links as it goes by, so it knows where to stop and where to start. So that's how that works, and all of the tracks are powered separately by different levels, so we're not wasting energy, just having DCC decoders chirping away, drawing up power. So we operate it that way. And then here is the shelf with all the information for the order of trains, the timetable, and all of that. So that's the overview of the elevators.